Hello YouTube, this is Sam Gerrans from quarternight.com. Today is Tuesday the 18th of December 2018, and today I want to look at the subject of China and what I would think is probably the future of the world and the worship of the state. Now, if you don't know my work, what I tend to generally talk about is the Quran, not from the point of view of what I call brand Islam, but from the point of view of what it contains, leaving aside the assumed conclusions of a religion created some 200 years later. In essence, I have quite a lot of thoughts on that subject, but one of the key ones is that what the metric or the template which the Quran presents is what I call the God protocol, which is, it's nothing to do with setting up a caliphate or anything along those lines, but if you read it with your eyes open, it's talking about a situation in which in various times to different communities, men have been sent to warn generally the elite of those times to rule properly. And I do believe we are ruled. I know everyone thinks they're free and amazing and unique and independent, but I assure you that they're not. And we are as ruled today as we ever were under the Caesars, just under greater layers of duplicity. And the corollary to this thesis is that once the rulers, the real rulers, I don't mean people who put little crosses on pieces of paper every few years, but the actual rulers, when they reject that advice, then what tends to happen is that those communities are utterly destroyed. Now, you may not like this scenario, and I may not like this scenario, and actually I don't like this scenario, but it is what it is. It says what it says. And I'm going to give you some reasons in this talk why I stick to this and why this is my main focus. You see, for me, we are trapped between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, we've got what I've just summarized, which I would call the God protocol, which is basically a format or a protocol under which the punishments of God become binding upon the people. Do I like this? No, I don't. It's if it doesn't terrify you, you don't really understand it. But what's the alternative? Now, in previous ages, obviously tyrannies have come and gone, and there have been some extremely efficient ones. But I believe that the tyranny that's being set up now is going to be so efficient. It already is so efficient. And what I see is that there is a unity of purpose between all countries which possess a central bank. That's basically it. And all countries, apart from one or two, do possess a central bank. And most of the companies which didn't have a central bank now have one. So that's where we're going. And what I want to do is just summarize or go over a couple of pieces. One is from the so-called Independent, laughably titled, of course. And it's just a snippet from an article. And then I'd like to talk about what's going on in China. So this article, and I'll put a link to it in the drop down below, it's on the subject of radical politics and extreme left or right-wing views. The sort of essence is what they want, the takeaway they want you to come away from this article with is that people who hold opinions which are not moderate are unable to see when they're wrong. So here's the key quote. We found that people who hold radical political beliefs, I'll unpack this in a minute, have worse metacognition than those with more moderate views, said lead author and neuroscientist Dr Steve Fleming. They often have a misplaced certainty when they're actually wrong about something and are resistant to changing their beliefs in the face of evidence that proves them wrong. End quote. Now, right and wrong, for a scientist to talk about right and wrong in today's world of pseudoscience is quite laughable. And of course, with this kind of setup, who decides whose views are moderate? If we look at how the world is today, it would be, if we take the West today, and what's happening in the West, look around you. Many societies would have considered this with a lot of justification utterly insane. Gross misrule, treason to the peoples of those countries. Just for starters, before you even get into the rest of the insanity that's happening, enforced sexual diversity and insanity, and it is insane. So what I'm saying is, if the sort of liberal leftists could point to some sort of success, which they can't, and that's what's different now between the 60s, when my parents' generation were young, they were living in a primarily fairly conservative sort of society, and so they could espouse the tenets of this insane leftism without having to prove anything. Well, now they've proved it, and what they've proven is that they are capable of nothing except creating dysfunctional families and dysfunctional societies and destroying everything. And if we look around us, what we see is that they'll use every faction, including the leftists. I don't think the leftists are on top of this, they're just useful idiots. But all factions are being used, and now it's gone to the level of now they're using women as a demographic to destroy society, and it's working perfectly. So I'm not here to decry this exactly. I'm just saying, if you know what I'm talking about, this will be clear to you. And if you don't know, or you don't care, or you disagree, well, then I'm sure you'll find something else to look at. So, first point here, going back to Dr. Steve Fleming's insightful comments, is that who decides whose views are extremist? I mean, presumably that would be Dr. Steve Fleming. And we've had this before. People who know my channel will know that I'm very connected with Russia. I happen to live in Russia, not because I think it's a wonderful country, but for various reasons I live here. My background was in Russian. We know all about scientists and doctors telling us whose views are right and wrong in this country. So I've seen this all before. On a personal note, I have found quote-unquote extremists, i.e. people with unconventional points of view, far more interested in and considerate of other people's opinions than liberals. There is no demographic that I can personally think of which is which responds in more of an aggressive, knee-jerk, triggered way to an opinion which doesn't fit with their preconceived ideas than liberals. It's very interesting to me that how this has been done. And quite honestly, liberals were the first ones to accuse absolutely everybody of being, for example, a Nazi. But the fact of the matter is that liberals, this type of liberal, these sorts of unthinking shock troops, had they lived in Nazi Germany, for example, or any other country, whether it was Mao Zedong's China, they would have been the most virulent supporters of those systems. And it's easy to prove. They're the most virulent supporters of this system. They are collectivistic in their DNA. They are not able to buck any sort of trend, and they like to think of themselves as the righters of wrongs, and in some way radical and progressive, when actually the entire orthodoxy is behind them. They do this in this system. Believe me, they would have done it in those systems. So the irony is that they would have been the ones lining the streets, raising their arms and crying Sieg Heil as Hitler went past in his open-top car. And people like myself would have been the dissenters. But that's perhaps a side point. The article in question then goes on and sort of discusses other quote-unquote views. They have to do this. But that's irrelevant. I happen to work in propaganda, and I'm looking at this from in terms of a propaganda trend. And these kind of articles, it doesn't matter what they say ultimately, or this article, because there'll be a whole campaign of articles like this. So for me, this is propaganda ground bait. This isn't one article, this will be 100 articles over time, you see. And that's how it works, getting these ideas into your mind. And then the liberals whom this is sort of geared towards, I mean, this happens to be, The Independent. Well, there is no, if you know the British media, there's no difference between The Independent, The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph. It's just one paper. They have exactly the same news. It's just one thing. They used to say in Russian, «Нет известий в правде, нет правды в известиях», which basically, there were two newspapers, Pravda, which translates as the truth, and Izvestia, which translates as the news. And the joke was amongst people at that time was there's no truth in the news and there's no news in the truth. Well, that's where we are now. So moving on to training and re-education. In the UK, because I want to get on to China and the training and re-education that's happening there, quote unquote. We lived in the UK for a year or two ago, and I'd been out of the country for about 15 years maybe a bit more. Everyone's been on training courses, and you can really feel it. And they've been on sensitivity training. The police have been on sensitivity training. And this is basically mind control. This is NLP-based mind control, which prevents the target from being able to follow their own good sense and operate on the basis of what they know by experience to be true. It's a way of cauterizing out of your psychology those things which are actually the antibodies. They're the antibodies which a society relies upon in order to expunge and to free itself of virulent influences. What's happening is that those antibodies, the main institutions, have been repurposed by groups like Common Purpose and other types of NLP-based mind control, in order to prevent those people from being able to use their brains, to be able to think anymore. And this type of mind control uses well-sounding slogans. It always did. You see, I've experienced or caught the tail end of communism, and I read a lot about it and talked to many people who lived through it. So I know all about slogans. So I see the West in those terms. It is a sort of a fuzzy, touchy-feely combination between Teletubbies, McDonald's, and a concentration camp with feedback forms where everybody has to smile and give you points out of 10 for their experience of dealing with this or that kind of organization. It is bizarre, and it is weird, and it is dysfunctional. So this type of mindset, and a cult, and it is a cult, it's the big cult, uses well-sounding slogans and assumed conclusions. And we know all about those. If you've had anything to do with any sort of religion, whether it be Brand Islam or the Southern Baptists or the Jehovah's Witnesses, you'll know all about well-sounding slogans and assumed conclusions. This is how cults work. What they're doing is creating a much bigger cult, one which is very efficient. And in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Scientologists and the Moonies and so on, these are petri dishes. They're allowed to exist by the intelligence agencies because they know that they can study them. Because what they're really doing, this is how it works, is they're training people into being able to switch psychopathy on and off. How to make decent people behave in indecent ways, in psychopathic ways. If you look, and I really recommend everyone should research one cult. Choose a cult, it doesn't matter which one, because they're all basically the same, and it will educate you in what this is. They all use the same basic techniques. Social pressure. They use techniques of name calling. They use techniques of sloganeering, and also being excommunicated from the group. They use the idea of you being sort of like a chosen group, and they'll use that not at our level, but at the level of the middle managers and the top managers of this tyranny. I mean, they've got a whole new propaganda for them too. Read 1984. There's a different set of propaganda for each level in the matrix. What they tell the proles is not the same as what they tell the party members, but it's all propaganda. Anyway, so they'll be using this, and clearly have been using this on the police. It was clear when we had some very minor dealings, something to do with noisy neighbours and my mother not liking it, but it was very interesting watching how they operated. And they were not interested at all in actually addressing anything. They were much more interested in a process of public relations finessing and what I would call pseudo work, which pseudo work is very socialistic. Anyway, so this kind of mindset is based in allegiance to a pre-existing set of conclusions, and the people on whom this is practiced, the people who have this quote-unquote training, have no idea what that set of agendas looks like. But they will be forced through social conditioning and normalcy bias and wanting to belong to the group and wanting to keep their money to start to pay lip service to this thing. And as everyone around them changes, that's how it's all done. They're changing things. And everybody's talking about change. I mean, if you look at Obama, who is he's a prime example of this kind of change agent. I mean, his whole thing was about change. Well, nobody stopped and asked what kind of change this was. Well, I'm telling you what the change is. The change is they're creating a society which is going to be an extremely efficient tyranny. And at first, it's going to look okay-ish. And also, this is why they're creating such a mess, so they can seem to clear it up. But after that will come what will come. And I know whereof I speak, as I'll get into, because of my Russia connection. So these same techniques in the West now are being used, and this is a Marxist set of agendas. It's all about destroying the family, and the way you destroy the family is you destroy the man's lead role in that family. And this goes back to the suffragette movement. And again, I'm aware that these movements use well-meaning slogans and point to scenarios in which perhaps there is an injustice of some kind, or there is an injustice of some kind, but they don't care about the injustice, if that's what in fact it is. They don't care about that. What they care about is manipulating people who don't understand what this agenda is into being the shock troops and the useful idiots for advancing another agenda. And suffragette movement was really the start of that, and certainly performed those duties, leaving aside whether or not the actual issues of the day. And I don't want to get into those because then they're actually irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether women and men vote. If you haven't got control of your own mind, just having more mindless people out there putting X's on boxes to vote to change the night manager at Burger King. It doesn't make any difference, because that's all democracy does. It doesn't make any difference who you vote for. As if you've listened to this far, you probably already worked that one out. So these same techniques of manipulation, mind control, neurolinguistic programming, social pressures and so on are being used currently to bring in enforced homosexualization of the society. Again, using all the same techniques, pointing to some real injustices or real or perceived injustices, and again using this sloganeering process, and using in this case very often extremely ill and troubled people, so-called transsexuals, in order to enforce excuse me, a new level of unreality upon the general population. And now, if you don't want that, don't want it in your schools, you don't want a drag queen or somebody who's had sexual reassignment surgery, whatever we mean by that, running your school, you're a bad person. Now, if this had happened 25 years ago, even, it would have been an absolute uproar. But because it's the frog in the saucepan, and because this plan exists, and when you know what the plan is, you can just see it going through the milestones. But people within it, they don't see it. And when we were in England, I found people frightened. Basically, they couldn't talk, they wouldn't talk. I've seen it before. It was called the Soviet Union. So this is how cults work. And once they get you disregarding your own good sense, they've got you. And once they can make you do it once, they can make you do it again. As the famous quote attributed to Voltaire, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And as I say, we have seen this before. Let's take Nazi Germany, which is always the bad boy, the one that's rolled out as the epitome of all evil, although I would say there have been many pretenders to that particular accolade. It's the very people who today are so quick to call others quote-unquote Nazis, whatever they mean by that, although they don't often know what they mean by that, who would have been, as I said earlier, the most enthusiastic supporters of that regime, because they are collectivistic worshippers of the government. And worshippers of the state. And had they been, since they're that in this society, they most certainly would have been that in that society. But far worse than Germany, we have Soviet Russia, a system created by and enforced by many of the same ethnic interests that we have behind Marxism 2.0, which is driving the leftist agenda in the West. But this time they're using Cass Sunstein and his nudges as the means of change for now, rather than bullets. But that will change. If you don't know who Cass Sunstein is, I don't recommend that you buy his book. I did read it. It's pernicious and it's filthy reading. It's worth knowing that this is how people who rule you think. It's fluffy fascism. It's basically you're too stupid to know what you want, so we're going to induce you to want what is right for you. I'm going to go back to Dr. Steve Fleming, who often have a misplaced certainty when they're actually wrong. Now, these people, they believe they know what's better for you and what's better for me, and they're going to tell us what's right. That there is no God, that there is no meaning in life. There's only you and the state. And if you were a realist, you'd just basically get with the program. Because who could possibly be against all of these well-meaning, wonderfully presented, assumed conclusions? And if you are, you're a bad person. And as in China, as we'll get to, they're going to have a moral responsibility to help you. They're already helping you in the West. The left, I mean, I don't see it as a left-right paradigm, but the left, for now, likes to use the language of concern. I mean, if you look at the wars, just as an aside, that Britain and America inflicts as part of this broader agenda, because it's never about an actual war. We haven't actually declared war since the Second World War, I believe. Certainly America hasn't. It's all about, these are compassionate bombs. They're not bombing you because they hate you or they think that our God is greater than your God. No. They want to bomb you into the ground and kill you and your children and your families because we love you. Because we care about you. We want to help you stop making all these mistakes. We want to help you overcome your, quote, misplaced certainty when you're actually wrong about something. This is how it works. And because it doesn't look brutal, because it smiles, because it's not wearing a swastika and and a military uniform, it wears a shirt and tie, or even worse now, they wear T-shirts and want you to call them Tony. But the bombs are the same. Anyway, moving on to China. China has brought in a system of social credit. So this is a rating system where, for now, and it doesn't sound so terribly oppressive now. I mean, it sounds like a real pain, but it's not the worst thing you can imagine yet. But understand, this is just the beginning. All public relations, all public re-education systems move incrementally. You can't spook the sheep. That's how it works. Okay. So it has this system, which I'm sure most people listening to this know about. If you don't, look it up online. You can learn as much as you want to know about it. So under this system, you have no international travel. You start off with a certain number of points. And anybody who watched the television of the 1970s knows what the points mean. Prizes. So you stick with these point system. And if you go under a certain number of points, now you're a bad person. And you can get bad points for dropping litter. I mean, you can see what it's going to be in the West, can't you? You speak to a woman in a tone of voice that she 16 years later decides she didn't like, and suddenly you can't use a plane. You can definitely get where it's going to go. But for right now, it's in the sort of the Chinese style of how they're presenting this. So you lose all these things which now you start to think of not as rights, but as privileges. So basically, it's you and the state. The state can tell you what you can and cannot do. This is a much more honest, in a way, situation than we have in the West, where this is the same situation is fundamentally hidden by several layers of duplicity. But you can worm your way back into the good graces of Big Brother by giving to charity, for example, i.e. the state. Good deeds are rewarded by an increased social score, but those deeds have to be seen. So think about that. You're in a situation where just doing a good deed because God commands it isn't enough. And we're already there with a Western form of this. If you go on Facebook, you have people, I don't know, some guy sitting across from a couple of homeless people in his car, and he picks up the phone and pretends to be a plainclothes policeman and says, these two guys are undercover and we'd really like you to bring them out some food, and oh, isn't this wonderful, and it gets 21 million likes. What happened to just doing it and keeping quiet about it? What I'm trying to say is that these are two sides of the same stick. They're two ends of the same stick. These are two ends of the same candle, and they're going to burn toward each other, and that's always been the plan. So this is a kind of what you might call a carrot-like stick. But there exists the real stick, and there are whole communities of Uyghur Muslims, and they've been taken away into re-education camps and are being fully indoctrinated into love for the state. According to many reports, many are being killed, and there's somewhere between 1 and 2 million people there. This is coming, and as somebody who has experience of Soviet, the joys of living under a Soviet regime, you can bet that it isn't going to be good. What I've noticed is that there's no outcry about this. I mean, just for comparison, what would happen, would you say? I mean, if for example, let's just take a country at random, France took just 50 Jews into re-education camps, what do you think would happen to France? The country would be blockaded and bombed into the ground in a month. So, reading between the lines, what China's doing is absolutely fine with everybody. And of course it is, because this is part of the agenda. In the West, they're destroying, bringing the West down through this sexual depravity, through this unrealism, through this people, the antibodies that normally protect the society, now not only not doing their job, but actually fighting against the organism proper. And in Russia, in China, they've got this more sort of Chinese model, but they're parts of the same model. So in conclusion, they're creating the perfect tyranny. In the West, they're using this sort of breakdown of cultural norms for all the cultures, the original cultures. They're doing it to everybody. They're dumbing down the masses, if you haven't noticed, through what laughingly passes for education, so that now if you want your child to have even a half-decent education, you cannot go to school. You cannot use the system. There's a destruction of the culture and morality, which is following a strict agenda and never deviates from it. And the imposition of sexual degeneration. And this is an act of war. There was a case where in one of the many attacks by Israel on Palestine, I think it was Gaza Strip, where they went in and started killing everybody in self-defense, obviously. And one of their first actions when they went in was they went to the television station and started pumping out pornography. Now, why do you think they did that? They did it, I'll tell you why, is because they know that under high stress, men often have strong sexual urge, and if they can get a man to waste himself sexually, he's weak. It's an act of war. That's what the pornography is for. It's to make you weak. It's a military takedown. So, why are they doing it? Well, the point of this in the West is to get us to the point where things are so dysfunctional and so inoperable that what's going on in China will look good to us. That's what's happening. They've got to get... See, China doesn't have a quote-unquote democratic conception. I mean, we can get into whether democracy is real or not separately, but people in the West, and certainly in America, but even in England, have some conception of this. They have that sort of illusion, a persistent illusion. Well, they have to disabuse people of that, and that's why they're doing this. They're going to make everything so nothing works. But where China is, that's where it's going. But consider the insanity in the West and how quickly this has been enforced. Where if you call a man, somebody whose chromosomes are male, a man, you can lose tenure in a university. This is how utterly insane it is. And it's insane. It's meant to be. It's meant to be. But next it will be they'll say, if you believe in God, you're an extremist. If you want to bring up your child outside the state system, you're an extremist. If you don't want to eat GMO food or take injections, you're an extremist. And to be perfectly honest, the people that you're going to fear are going to be your own family. I mean, when we lived in the UK, I'd say it completely came to that, but I was certainly aware of how utterly indoctrinated the people of my own family are. They're only a couple of Radio 4 documentaries away from deciding, because they love you so much, that they're going to make a couple of telephone calls. Of course, they would be horror-struck after you've lost your child and so on. It won't make any difference. It's how it works. Good people doing evil things. And these people are basically good, but they don't understand the time that they're living in. And if you do understand the time that you're living in, you cannot wait for people to catch up. Because by the time they finally, like cows, by the time it finally begins to dawn on them, it'll be too late. And anyway, I don't think that will even happen. Why? Because they have cauterized their own ability to reason so many times that they've become committed to this lie. The lie has become theirs. This is how brainwashing works. And it doesn't matter. People often, another aside here, people often wonder why it is that, say, for example, 9/11 and these various other so-called terrorist acts, why they're so obviously inside jobs. Why couldn't they have done a better job of covering it up? There's a reason. The people behind this know that they've got a lot of slack. They know that they can't really catch the 2 to 3 to 4% of people who can think. And anyway, they don't care about those people because they know they're not going to do anything, because they've got jobs, they've got mortgages. They know that, and they're right. But they know that the 95, 96% of people will believe anything, and that the holes in the narrative actually are beneficial. They're beneficial. Why? Because nobody can fool you like you can fool you. Because then you're fighting yourself. And if you committed to the last nonsense, if you committed to the Oklahoma bombing and said, oh yes, of course, this building managed to explode outwards from a bomb, it managed to explode inside out from a bomb planted outside the thing. If you really can accept that premise, well, of course you'll believe the next load of nonsense. And that's why this is really efficient. It's a highly efficient process of propagandizing. And nobody can fool you like you can. Now, what I've just said, that's probably already extremist, because I can see, and that's what extremism is going to look like. It's going to be anybody who can actually think is going to be an extremist. Now, I know where this goes. As I say, I live in Russia, and this state, I mean, not the present state, but this country, in this country, killed tens of millions of people. I mean, really killed. I'm not talking about Schindler's List or something. I'm talking about something based in actual, objective, verifiable reality that doesn't have to enforce its dogmas on everybody. I'm talking about something real. Tens of millions of people murdered, okay? And the people who were in that system were the same people who are in the system in the West now, the same people who are supporting the system in China. Basically, good people who want to go along to get along. But it's the dissidents that they come after. So I don't need to imagine, because I've seen it. I've seen it. I've spoken firsthand to people whose families were really wiped out. And the same propaganda is going on here. Anyway, that's a separate subject. So this is why, going back to my opening comments, why I do what I do. If the Quran is from God, if it is correct, if I'm correct about this God protocol, this warning the elite and then the punishments of God becoming binding, as extremist though it does obviously sound, and as unattractive as it sounds to me, and I'm sure to everybody else who's listening, I can personally see no alternative. And the reason is because this new system of tyranny it's already perfect. Look around you. If you live in the West, look around you, how completely and perfectly isolated from any type of ability to understand the context most people are. The vast, and when I say most people, I mean the most of the most people around you are. And then consider that even those people who really seem to get some part of what we're talking about here, about the scientific frauds, they've got people believing the most errant nonsense, demonstrably false nonsense. And those people who get that much, they get that much. And even those who talk about changing it and standing up and fighting the New World Order and stuff. And just as I've mentioned several times before, if the price of stopping this was simply to sign a contract in blood that you may never use a mobile device again for the rest of your life, if giving up something that nobody had 20 years ago was the total price of freedom, would they do it? No, of course not. And yet, as I've mentioned before, people have these illusions. And yet Germany, with real Germans, I'm not talking about libtard Germans sort of kneeling down with tears in their eyes, with open arms as they're being, stamped into the ground by people who've come to live off their benefits. No, I'm talking about real Germans who united and tried their very best. They couldn't throw this off. They were bombed into the ground. Now, I'm not a big supporter of Hitler, but that was I think to a large extent a real attempt to shake off this tyranny, and it was the last one. And it's been vilified ever since. You really think that your friend Tony, who gets his knickers in a twist if he gets the wrong kind of latte, you really think this guy is going to stop things? I don't believe it for a second, not for one. So, in summary, I know where we are, I know where we're going, because I know where we've been. And I can see what's happening, and I can see that this is never going to get any better. More than that, it's only going to get perfectly worse. And they're creating a system that I don't want my children to live in, because they're creating hell. And if you throw on top of that, I know I'm sort of jumping around here, but cryptocurrencies and so on, crypto technology, your entire life is going to be on the blockchain. They're creating a parody of taqwa, where the worship of the state, taqwa, if you don't know, taqwa is God consciousness. But this new God consciousness is going to be state consciousness. This is a religion. And they're nearly there. So I see no alternative. If the Quran is not from God, if I'm wrong about this, well, okay, I'm just one more crazy guy. But what I'm not going to do is spend my time personally joining groups led by certain agendas, or living under a bridge shouting at passing traffic. That isn't a solution. I look to what works. And in this book, what's worked is the protocol that I'm discussing, warning the elite, and then either the elite change tack, which has happened before, in which case the punishments of God are forestalled, or more typically they ignore those and ridicule them, and they are utterly destroyed. Not much of a choice, is it? Anyway, that's where I'm going to leave that there, and I hope after that lot everybody is well, or as well as can be expected in the circumstances. That's all for now. If you're listening on YouTube, you can download my full translation of the Quran free using the button in the top right hand corner, or buy the hard copy there at 10% less than on Amazon. I also encourage you to sign up for the Quranite Plus newsletter on the site to get occasional micro updates. You can download the audio from my YouTube videos to your mobile device using the links in the drop down below. I recommend meetquranites.com to connect with other Quran alone believers. Like if you like, comment if you have something constructive to say, and subscribe to get more each week. And use the link in the drop down below to donate if you would like to help me keep doing this. And remember, this life is short. Eternity is long. If you want good trees, plant good seeds.